You may think tuberculosis is an antique disease, something that happens somewhere else in the past or in a distant place. Not so. Tuberculosis is the most deadly infectious disease in the world. Globally, more than 1 million people a year still die from TB. Cases in the United States are rising. The CDC reports cases of the deadly lung infection have increased more than 15% in 2023 compared to the year before. Author John Green, who you may know from YouTube, where he taught you some of what you know, or his best-selling novels like The Fault in Our Stars, has turned his skill towards this topic. His new nonfiction book is Everything Is Tuberculosis, and he joins us for tonight's interview. John, thank you for being here.
No, it's great to be with you.
You start the book, as I did a little bit, which is people think, well, this is tuberculosis, that's something out there. That's part of the story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a huge part of the reason why tuberculosis is still thriving, is because we think of it as a disease of the past, not a disease that's still infecting people every day. But in fact, over 10 million people will get sick with TB this year.
I think you wrote this in The Atlantic, where you have a piece we're going to get to in a minute, but you said the proximate cause is not M. tuberculosis, but Homo sapiens.
Yeah, I think ultimately the cause of tuberculosis in the 21st century is us, because we know how to treat and cure this disease. So you can't really say it's caused by a bacteria anymore. It's a bacteria we know how to kill. It's a bacteria we know how to deal with. The real cause of tuberculosis in the 21st century is humans, human choice, human-built systems, systems that leave some people out and include others.
Give me a sense of what you mean by those systems. Break off one piece of that.
Well, just to give you one example, in Sierra Leone, almost everyone who gets sick with tuberculosis will be poor, will be malnourished. They're overwhelmingly likely to have other healthcare problems. And so this is a disease that is affecting those people who are left out by systems, who aren't included, who don't have a chance to have opportunities to get the kind of healthcare that I would expect.
And you write about that system as it takes place all over the world. It's curable, but it takes some doing.
Yeah.
About a half a year of, give a sense of how long it takes and help people imagine what it would be like to go through that regimen in Sierra Leone.
It's difficult. I mean, it's 4 to 6 months of daily antibiotics that you have to take in a certain pattern. But my brother had cancer a couple years ago, and that was also difficult to cure. And he also needed months of chemotherapy and then radiation in order to be cured of his cancer. And at no point did anyone say, well, I'm sorry, Hank, but this is too expensive. This isn't cost effective. We have better uses of resources. Nobody said that to my brother, and nobody should be saying that to TB patients.
The story of TB in its contemporary form, and of course, because you're a historian in its history, you tell also through the story of Henry. Who is Henry, and why were you going to Sierra Leone in the first place?
So I was in Sierra Leone with my wife to learn about the maternal healthcare system there, because my wife and I support a maternal hospital in Sierra Leone. I didn't know that TB was still a thing. I was like most of us, where I thought TB was like the disease that killed John Keats, not a present tense phenomenon. But when we were there, we were asked to visit the tuberculosis hospital. And I was like, there's a tuberculosis hospital? And when we visited the TB hospital, LaCa, I met this boy named Henry, which is also my son's name. And he looked to be about the same age as my son, about 9 years old at the time. And Henry walked me all around the hospital and showed me the wards and showed me the laboratory. And eventually we ended up back with the doctors, and they sort of shooed him away. And I said, that's the sweetest little kid. And they said, he's not a little kid, he's 17. He just looked much younger because he was so emaciated, first by malnutrition and then by TB.
Can we linger on Henry for a second? He is throughout the story, but he emerges at times. He seems to have this source of joy inside him. And as you tell his story, it's not one for a Western reader that would sound like it has lots of places for joy. Where does that come from?
He's a very hopeful kid, but also it's important to understand that, like, people's lives in Sierra Leone are full of joy, just like people's lives here are. Every life is complex and multitudinous, and so I really wanted to capture that part of Henry's life and that part of his story, that he is, you know, he was sort of the mayor of that tuberculosis hospital. Everywhere he went, and still when he goes back, every time he goes back, he's still treated as, you know, oh, Henry's here, and everybody rubs his head and laughs with him and shakes his hand, and he's just, he's one of those unusually charismatic people who sometimes come into your life.
Now back to the current moment. The Trump administration has cut a great deal of foreign aid. You write about this in The Atlantic, jumping off from the book. Explain why those cuts have such an impact.
Well, almost all tuberculosis funding has been cut by the U.S. government, and that's catastrophic because the U.S. has long been the most generous supporter of the fight against TB. And so, unfortunately, what we're seeing is what one expert predicts is a 30% rise in multi-drug resistant tuberculosis over the next few years. That's not just catastrophic on an individual level. That person's TB becomes much harder to treat. It's also catastrophic on a societal level because it means we have much more drug-resistant tuberculosis floating around in communities, leading maybe most scarily to a possibility of a totally drug-resistant form of tuberculosis that none of our tools can cure, which is a threat to all of us.
That's right. Tuberculosis knows no borders in that sense. If it happens in Sierra Leone and it's drug resistant, it can travel around the world.
Or India or Pakistan or anywhere else, it can travel around the world. Diseases don't know about political borders and they don't have a moral compass. So they aren't going to say, well, let's not come to the United States. In fact, we already have a lot of tuberculosis in the United States. As you said in the intro, we're seeing rising rates of TB in the US.
Explain how the staccato treatment leads to drug resistance with tuberculosis.
So because you need to be on treatment for 4 to 6 months, that has to be a very consistent treatment. And if you abandon that treatment, even for a couple weeks before restarting it, a lot of times those drugs that worked initially will no longer work because the disease will have had those 2 or 3 or more weeks to develop a strategy for resisting one or more of those drugs. Now, most of those drugs are from the 1940s or 1950s, and so they aren't particularly new. We do have newer antibiotics, but in some cases, TB is also evolving resistance to them.
In your last book of essays, you had a sentence that stuck with me when you're talking about humanity's temporal range, and you wrote, "Such despair only worsens our already slim chance at long-term survival." Apply that sentence to your worldview about the story of tuberculosis as you see it now. Do you see it as one where improvements can be made? Do you make grand claims about it relative to your overall worldview about how intractable problems like this can be addressed?
I know intractable problems can be addressed. The year I graduated from high school, 12 million children died under the age of 5, and last year fewer than 5 million did. That's one of the greatest accomplishments in human history, and it wasn't natural, it wasn't inevitable. It happened as a result of millions, or billions if you count taxpayers, of human beings coming together and working to make the world safer for children. We can do that with tuberculosis, we can do that with other diseases of injustice like malaria and HIV as well.
As a novelist, this is a nonfiction, but it's narrative nonfiction.
Yeah.
How was that experience different? Did you feel like Henry was in the sidecar next to you as you were writing? Did you feel a greater burden because in part you've got another real human's life that you're telling stories about? How was the act of writing different?
Well, it is inconvenient not to be able to make things up, for sure. I sometimes wish I could, but in another way, it's very fulfilling. I mean, the truth is Henry's story and the story of his mother and the other stories I tell in the book are so astonishing that you couldn't make them up. To me, the nonfiction version of the story is as astonishing as anything that I could have ever invented, and so I didn't feel the need to write fiction.
Will you tell me the story of what happened with Johnson & Johnson and the tuberculosis drug that I'm not going to try and pronounce because I'll get it wrong?
I call it bedaquiline, but I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly either.
It will be bedaquiline for the purposes of this conversation.
Great. So Johnson & Johnson, using mostly public money, developed a new drug for tuberculosis called bedaquiline, which is a very powerful drug, especially against drug-resistant tuberculosis, and a really key tool for us. But unfortunately, it remained far too expensive for many people in poor countries. And so Johnson & Johnson, when they tried to extend their patent to create a secondary patent, a lot of people came together to say, that's unacceptable, we need lower prices and generic competition for this drug now. And as a result of all those people coming together, J&J eventually abandoned all of their desires for secondary patents, and now the price of bedaquiline has dropped by 55% in 1 year. You
had pushed Johnson & Johnson, and I wonder whether in that case you see maybe some hope for what this book will do as well in terms of changing policy. Yeah, I want to be clear that I was a very small part of that story. I'd like to portray myself as the hero, but I really wasn't, unfortunately. Well, as you write so often, the heroes are often the result of multi-layered historical forces that get there. That's exactly right. And so this was really the result of a virtuous cycle that took many, many years.
That said, it does give me hope. I think despair is very tempting. And despair is very tempting right now for a lot of people, and I absolutely understand that. The problem with despair is all it makes is more of itself. All despair tells us is not to get out of bed in the morning, not to fight for a better world. It's easy to feel like this is the end of the story, and it's easy to feel very discouraged. I feel discouraged in this moment, but this is not the end of the story. This is the middle of the story, and together we fight for a better end.
John Green, the book is Everything Is Tuberculosis. Thank you.
Thank you so much.